Now let's take a few minutes and talk about a serious problem concerning the Palestinian refugees. I want to explain briefly how this situation developed and what the situation is right now. Do you remember in the War of Independence in 1948, 5 Arab states attacked Israel? When those Arab states invaded Israel, what they did was they started to make announcements on the radio and on the public broadcast system, and they urged all the Arab residents to leave, to flee, so that they could quickly come in and make war. They told all the Arabs to get out, go to a neighboring, go to Lebanon, go to Egypt, go to Syria, go to Jordan, go somewhere else. We're going to kill the Jews really fast. This war is going to be a piece of cake, and as soon as we do, then you can come back, but we don't want to accidentally kill you while we're killing Jews. So many of the Arabs living there heeded those broadcasts, and they left their homes. But what happened was Israel won the war, and they were never able to come back to their homes. That's the original context of how the refugee problem began. Now, some Arabs were wise enough not to heed the warnings of the invaders, and they didn't leave their homes and properties. And do you know, those Arabs are there in their homes to this very day, and they are successful and productive citizens of Israel. They knew better than to leave their homes because God was on Israel's side, and the wise ones are still there. So what happened is, after the war, there were these about 700,000 Palestinian refugees living in neighboring nations. Now, at the same time as that war in 1948 displaced those 700,000 Palestinians, and they were only displaced because their own Arab leaders told them to go. But at the same time, at least as many Jewish refugees were kicked out of surrounding Arab nations. At that time, I think over 700,000, close to 1 million Jewish refugees were either coming out of Europe's Holocaust, the survivors needed to get to the Jewish homeland, and there were a number that were leaving Iraq and Syria and Egypt and Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula. They were fleeing, and the difference is they were quickly admitted and absorbed into the little fledgling state of Israel, which really didn't have the money to absorb 1 million new people, but they did. Those refugees, the Jewish ones, were not left homeless at all. But those Arab refugees could have easily and quickly been absorbed into those neighboring nations. In fact, those were the very nations that had attacked Israel. They could have been absorbed into Egypt and into Jordan and into those surrounding states. But those surrounding states didn't want to touch them. They didn't want to lift a finger or give them a dime. They didn't want to take them out of those sort of temporary squalid refugee camps. And they left them there and left them there and left them there. And not one Arab nation ever offered to resettle them or absorb them or admit them the way that Israel admitted all those Jewish refugees. And what happened is the years went by. And if you can believe it, the generations went by, and those refugees had children, and they had a lot of them. And then those children had children. So now the original refugees had grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and no one had ever offered to help them get out of those camps and build apartments or build houses or be absorbed. And so what ended up happening was there are now millions of what are being called refugees. But you need to understand something about international law concerning refugees. There have been over 50 million refugees in the last 2 world wars, and it has never ever happened that the children or grandchildren of the original displaced peoples received the status by the international community of being called refugees. In other words, the original generation that got displaced, they were refugees, and then they settled somewhere and they had children, but their children were never given the status of refugees. The only time this has ever happened was with these Palestinians, and the whole international community agreed to play this game to call all the generations of the original displaced people refugees. And this is really a terrible political game they're playing. They want to make Israel look bad. They want to force Israel to open their doors to what is now millions of Arabs who have been kept in these camps for 3 generations. Now, surely you can see that this tiny Jewish state could not possibly open its doors to millions of angry Palestinian refugees that have been in camps for 3 generations. You might say, why? Well, Israel is the Jewish homeland. Israel is the only territory in the entire world, 8,000 little square miles. It's the only land where the Jews have a homeland. Just like Armenia is for the Armenians and Turkey is for the Turks, Zion is for the Jews. And if they open their doors to these millions of so-called refugees, they will be so outnumbered, it won't be a Jewish homeland anymore. And there's no way any amount of pressure can make Israel do this. And so it's a constant bone of contention. And the only thing I can say is their Arab brothers and sisters need to admit them and absorb them and take them into their lands. It was those very nations that caused the refugee problem by attacking Israel in the first place on the day of her birth in 1948. They created the refugee problem. These are their own people, their own flesh and blood, and they need to take responsibility and spend a little bit of their billions of oil dollars to help absorb and settle their brothers and sisters. So that's the situation on the refugee problem.